Okay, so the subject at hand is, as we've been saying, is purpose, and it's quite a boring sounding word, and yet I really have never met a happy person, which is a very loaded word we're going to talk about just now, but I've never met a person that isn't completely integrated into their life, that isn't driven in some way with purpose. You know, if you can imagine, since the beginning of man's cognitive thought, since we became aware of the fact that we were thinking, and since we became aware of the fact that we could analyze our processes and our actions, and we've been in this conversation of, I want you to almost imagine someone sitting on a cliff face, staring at the sunset at any era and wondering, just able to tell that we're part of this incredible purpose pattern, but we don't really know exactly what it is and how we fit into it. And that's a really interesting thing. And the first thing I want to connect us with is a very difficult idea. The first thing that really, really disconnects us from purpose is this bullshit idea that we need to be happy. Now, straight away, I mean, the first thing that comes up is, well, of course we want to be happy, and why can't I be happy? But I want to challenge this concept immediately and show you the toxicity of this idea. And I'm going to lean on a very, very powerful author in this case, someone who influenced my life quite greatly, and I've mentioned him before, and his name is Scott Peck. I think one of the books he wrote was called The Road Less Traveled, and he's actually just a normal psychologist, very spiritual man, but he was actually in the psychologist field. What makes this man absolutely profound is in his teachings, he taught, and you find this in many schools of thought, that the most damaging thing to the psychology of a human being is the quest for happiness. And that essentially we sell this incredible package to our children, even though we know that contrary to actual experience, that their goal in life is to be happy. Even though perhaps we, looking back at our lives, know on what a deep level we have been challenged, we sell it to our children really, really fast, and we make it seem very simplistic. We almost give them this blueprint of going to school, and we all know how this outplays, going to university and getting married, and not saying that any of these things aren't powerful. And he goes on to say in his book that one of the most powerful things we could ever do with youngsters is actually teach them that life is extremely challenging, that this is the greatest hero's journey that they will ever go on, and essentially teach them to problem solve from a very early age. And it's quite an extraordinary thing, because many of us are sitting amidst adversity, problems, experiences we're not sure how to solve energetically and emotionally, but we kind of have lost the sense of adventure, that we were actually meant to be extremely challenged. No one has ever been alive that has not been. So I'm just connecting to us to that idea of, you know, happiness is such a funny word. Let's deconstruct it a little bit. You know, if we get into great authors like T.S. Eliot, and we start to get to this idea where essentially happiness can only be born of the victories and the victories of adversity. And that's a really interesting thing. If you look at your own life, you certainly can have moments where you feel, let's say, happiness or a lightness. But happiness as a loaded word is a completely different thing when you think about the great satisfaction that you've had in your lives when you have overridden, problem solved, and stood up in adversity and come out the other side. So it's a really interesting thing. And the second thing I want to put us into the space before we even open the conversation of purpose. So we're looking at the possible toxicity of this idea of being happy. The idea of being happy is almost the idea of wanting to not be amidst difficulty, not wanting to be amidst problem solving, and almost losing touch, as I said, with an effective problem solver and the absolute satisfaction that comes with those victories. The second thing, which is a really contentious issue, is the idea. There is a poem about the fact that happiness is a very elusive spirit that can never be caught. But if you sit in the gardens of peace quietly for long enough, you will notice that she's best friends with happiness, and happiness comes and flits across her gardens. And the whole poem is essentially about the fact that you cannot find happiness. You can look and look and look. But have you ever noticed how happiness is born of peace? It's an extremely strange statement, but any time that you really are in a sense of peace in your relationship, sense of peace in your job, a sense of purpose and peace, looking out, essentially watching the sunset. And we really have underestimated how much happiness actually gets born of peace. Now, why is this important in this conversation? Well, the majority of people that are searching for a purpose are searching for a way to quell a restlessness, are searching for a way essentially to push aside certain things that they have to fully feel. And what we see there, that reminds me of a story by my favorite teacher, Manly P. Hall. He tells this really long, beautiful story about this neurotic man who was so enamored to find a purpose, so driven to find a purpose, and not taking into account the conversation we just had. And essentially, he became part of this organization. And this organization was involved with the upliftment and empowerment of mankind. And being the neurotic he was, but was very driven by what he thought was really, really good proclivities and a good personality and what he thought was love. Essentially, what happened is he brought his neuroses, his anxieties, let's almost call it his discord, into every aspect of the organization that he became part of. And essentially, eventually, in this long, beautiful story, almost rushed away in a fanfare of judgment and anger that the world was so messed up and that the organization was so corrupt. And in the same story, he tells the story of another person who essentially had a sense of peace in them before they began their purpose pattern or search. I call it a purpose pattern because to me, it's aligning with the pattern that's trying to show itself to you. And in the story, it's so beautiful that this guy goes and joins the same organization, and he just meets the most incredible people, and they respond so well to him, and he's so moved by the work that they're doing. And the whole story, a lot of people find so simplistic, how one of the greatest minds of our time tells that story when he talks about purpose. But essentially, to the minds in this room, I'm sure you are already realizing, he is essentially saying that you take yourself wherever you go, that you take your inner stuff, no matter what you are part of. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that just now. So I am challenging us to almost say that happiness is not a lack of adversity, that happiness is a byproduct of the victories of the initiations of the soul. And where that puts us is, it's also an extraordinary thing. Is another thing before we go into the subject is, I've noticed, and I think many great philosophers have commented on this in the last 100 years, that we are amongst a generation that believes that is above certain tasks. It's an extraordinary thing. And I just want you to anchor that sentence for a moment. We are a generation that thinks we are above certain tasks. You know, I see it so much in spiritual communities, even amongst people that I've been close with, where they will preach a very powerful version of love and light and galactic movement and acceleration, but they would not think to help the person literally in their neighborhood or to become involved in something practical, because we all want to be part of this romantic story and this victorious expression that only works in words until it needs to be put into action. And there's almost a lack of humility, I think, to a degree in many of us. So when we discuss purpose, there's a very interesting kind of thing that comes to mind. I've been reading a series of, I suppose you could call them studies over the last few years, a crossover between neurology and psychology, something very interesting for you to look in for yourself. And they've discovered that one of the biggest, now we're not talking about inflammation and the physical and biological factors, we're talking about psychological factors. And what they've discovered is that the biggest threat to happiness, or let's turn that around, one of the greatest modern causes of depression is choice. Now, that sounds really strange because we would go, well, we've always had choice, and I'm going to challenge that. And I want to deepen what the study actually says. The more choice or options that we have, the more depressed we are becoming. And the more options that we have, the less committed we are to what it is that we are doing. And the less committed we are to what we are doing, the more we are suffering. Now, those are very big statements, and we're going to break them down. But essentially, I want you to consider something. Do you know, in most tribes, it's a fascinating conversation. I've heard Teal Swan talk about this recently. In most tribes in antiquity, in other words, unless you listen to a modern adaptation, they do not even have a word for depression. They have words for initiations. They have words for fear. They have words for facing your dark side. They have all these words. They do not have a word for depression. That's an incredible thing. Another thing we know in neurology is that there is a part of your brain. Now, this blows my mind. I cannot give you all the factors. I'm not a neurologist. It's an easy Google. There is a part of your brain that when it is constantly challenged, not traumatized, that's different, constantly challenged, always picks the positive outlook. That's an incredible thing. And what they've discovered, there's words for this in neurology, is that there is a certain threshold that if you're above that threshold, in other words, problem solving and knowing what needs to get done, being tired, being challenged, having the odd cry, they've realized that with the brain, as long as it is kept there, there is something innate in your brain, and there's words for it, and they explain it, that will go when faced with the outcomes. It will pick the most positive or uplifting outlook. Now, this is the most incredible thing about the study, is that they've realized that if a person becomes too malaise or comfortable, or the more we try and take away the stresses of everyday life and romanticize things. What is a shopping mall? It is a romanticization of life. Let's take away the extremes of weather. Let's take away the ability for something to become light and dark. Let's take away the ability for there to be insects and for there to be sunburn. Let's create the perfect environment by which we can romanticize this process of walking around. And what I'm talking about is then you are in the state of essentially not being challenged. You are extremely comfortable. And what the brain does is, now this mixes in with the study of choice. What the brain essentially does when it is comfortable or when it is not being challenged is it actually goes into a state of depression, and it begins to pick less positive outlooks. This is not a spiritual study. This is a psychological and neurological study. So two things there. Let's just really think about what we're saying. And you might not be sure how choice makes you depressed. We're going to get to that now. But I want you to just consider these individuals that talk about being challenged, being in the zone, rising to meet whatever it is that's coming up. And when you are beginning your journey towards purpose, I want to ask you straight away, because we're all going to fall off this bus at different times. Some people really just want their lives to mean something. You know what some people want? They want to be comfortable. They want to be in a version of their lives that they will not doubt. They want to be in a version of their lives where the millions of choices that are now available to us will not gnaw away at them, causing some malaise and some self-doubt and some sort of melancholy. Now let's look at this thing about choice. Let's really challenge ourselves. This idea of why choice is making us depressed. Do you think that an individual who essentially has to wake up in the morning, let's go to some tribal system, let's use the Amazon. Now, let's say that when you wake up in the morning, essentially what you need to do is you need to spend a good portion of the day collecting food. You need to protect your family. You need to make sure that none of you get hurt. And there's certain things. You need to get water. You have your human interaction in between. And then at some stage, at the end of the day, you need to get a lot of rest and then repeat. Now, to the modern mind, that sounds terrible. It sounds absolutely terrible. It sounds like, wow, those lives really don't sound enriching. And what modern research is showing us, it is this quite the opposite. Hence, I mentioned that they didn't have a word for depression. Now, we could have a very interesting conversation that we're not going to dive into tonight on why. But what they've discovered on the most extraordinary things is there is a deep satisfaction in getting something done if you know it is what has to be done. Now, that doesn't have to sink yet. You're going to see what this has to do with your own process. Do you think a person that wakes up in a village that has to make food, collect water, hunt, do whatever they have to do, protect their children, fix their hut, do you think they have an option? They know that that is what needs to be done. And it is an extraordinary realization to realize that a lot of our suffering does not come from what is being done and what is being experienced. It is because we have a story about the fact that it should be another way. I'm not talking about pain. I experience pain all the time. Suffering is very different. I mentioned T.S. Eliot in his beautiful poem. He talks about the fact that a bird can sit, he was sitting in Scotland one year during the winter, and that a bird can sit on a bough and completely freeze and die and fall to the earth without ever feeling sorry for itself. And it was in his opinion that birds feel pain but don't suffer. And it was an extraordinary thing for a great mind to say. And you see it in animals. While they are experiencing pain, they certainly feel pain, but they do not build a story around it. Now, what does this have to do with purpose? We have 100 options on shampoo bottles. We have 100 options on food. We have 100 options on where we should live. We have 100 options on possibly what class we could live in if we worked harder, if we killed ourselves working harder, if we decided to be a surf bum. Now let's go into relationships. We are bombarded daily by social networks, by options, on possibilities. And we, of course, think that this is some form of evolution, and it is literally causing a psychic collapse within mankind. And once again, what does this have to do with purpose? What do you think it is like for a person who has decided what it is that they want to fully commit to, what it is that they want to do? They don't suffer, they experience discomfort, but they are 100% in to the thing that they are doing. And one of the greatest mistakes that we make when it comes to purpose is that we like to believe that it is not going to be something of discomfort, as we discussed. We also have lost touch with the absolute purity of simplistic things. If you look in Mahayana Buddhism, if you look into Zen, these guys found happiness, for that word to be playful, enlightenment and fulfillment through mundane tasks. And that certainly does not mean that I am calling us for us to be mundane. And what I would like us to do, I would like us to take such a powerful self-assessment of our lives in the next coming weeks while I have conversations with you. And what I would like you to do is I would like you to get to the point that if you are in a relationship, that you choose to fully be in that relationship. It's an extraordinary thing. Either do something or don't. Now, that's quite a controversial comment. If the job that you are currently in is the best thing available to you, are you able to fully show up for that thing? That's an extraordinary question. If we took away the options that were available to you, you would be happier. That's the really scary thing. We are literally frozen by this idea that there is always some better possibility. Just think about that for a second. That is what paralyzes us from getting married. It's what paralyzes us from committing fully to a business. Now, I want you to understand that I am not suggesting that this conversation is about settling. I'm not even suggesting that for a second. I just want us to be able to look at the bullshit surrounding the way our mind works. And if we understand the role that choice is playing and options are playing, we will begin to understand what that feeling is that many of us are disconcerted about, that feeling of always thinking that there's something better. When that begins to play in us, and this is the extraordinary part of the study, that most people only begin to report that they seriously need to find a new purpose when they are highly uncomfortable. Now, there are two types of discomfort when it comes to purpose. And the one is very powerful, and we're going to use it as a propellant to open up a less practical spiritual conversation. But the first one is the one that we need to be very cautious of. 50% of people that report searching for a purpose deep in a depression are doing so because they are uncomfortable, because they are challenged, because they are battling to just be with what needs to be done. Not because it lacks meaning. Not because it lacks meaning. But of course, the exciting thing is when we feel discomfort, it's not always because we're not stepping up to the task. Sometimes it is because we are being pushed to even greater things. And I think that is a part of the conversation that's actually quite exciting to have. I want you to consider how toxic this modern thing of having too many options is. Let's look at spirituality. Do you know one of the greatest things about being young? Before you discover that you think you've been lied to by your religion, or you think you've been lied to by your spiritual movement, one of the most incredible things about being young is giving your full sanctity, your full sanctity, what's the word? Anyway, giving your full expression to something. And I want to put it in a different way. Believing that that is the full version of something. And this is how it plays out. I remember reading certain stories, religious stories, with such a profound message. Now, there was not for a moment in me any belief that that was anything but guidance from God, which I still believe it was, no matter what religion I was in. And in that state, I remember the sanctity that I brought to that text. It was part what was written in that text, but it was part what I was bringing to it. I would read the words. I would read the story. I would feel it within me. And that thing became a transporting vessel by which I created character, by which I took on behaving differently in situations, by which I literally tried to be a better person. And what happens is later on, we discover that there are so many more spiritual teachings. And this can be a fantastic thing if we are ready for something greater. But instead of us being soaked up in a deeper wisdom, what has essentially happened is we are in the cookie cutter copy and paste generation that knows no wisdom. We are the people of 1,000 words and no understanding. And I challenge you to just consider what it would be like to take a sacred book. Doesn't matter what, Course in Miracles. It could be a conversation with God. It could be the Good News Bible. And take that book and to truly believe that that's the vessel that you're going to use. Do you see what kind of sanctity you bring to that information? Do you remember that feeling when you first discovered that perhaps it wasn't as special as you thought it was? This is the same disconcerting energy that we are bringing to all things. When you first occurs to you that being a tailor might not be a great purpose, where for thousands of years, the greatest pride of man was to pass on a skill. It's called an artisan for a reason. It is a great art to be a bard, which is a singer, or to be and to pass the skill on to someone, to be able to fix shoes, to be able to work and make watches. A watchmaker was one of the most profound professions for hundreds of years. And now we are the generation that is above tasks. We don't wash people's feet, and we don't serve food, and we don't clean buildings. And because surely purpose is so great that I will just sit upon a platform and change the world. And it's a very, very triggering thing in us to look at that possibility. But just connect to that sacredness that we bring to things. Why do we bring that sacredness? Think about it recently. Have you picked up a book recently that your soul decided this is so in alignment with true spirit? What's that page like? Maybe the person who gave it to you, you revere. Maybe the teacher you look up to. What is that page like? Your entire consciousness changes. You open that book and you read the first sentence and you're like, oh, wow. We bring half of the sanctity to things. And that is an important discussion to have when you are going to approach what your purpose is. So where that leaves us now is we start to get a little bit practical. The last problem I'd like to, because it's not all going to be problems. The next problem I'd like to put into our space is no one wants to be brutally honest with us. Do you want to share something, Sanya?
I just have a question, whether you're going to get to it or not. You mentioned that there are two types of discomfort when it gets to purpose, and you said 50% of those is because it's uncomfortable. And I don't know if you mentioned the second one, whether I missed it, or if you're going to mention it.
I'll mention it again, no problem. So a large majority of people are not aware of the fact that when they're searching for purpose, they're actually saying that they are not able to bring sanctity, sacredity almost, to what they're doing. They're not able to face themselves and be present. And so the drive for purpose is essentially to escape oneself. Then there's a second force of discomfort, which is one that's a little bit more exciting and shows up for people that have done the work. And that kind of discomfort is a discomfort that is caused by the soul, where the soul is actually telling you, okay, expand, move, shift. And those are the two types. The one is an absolute avoidance of what would be a beautiful task if you were present with it. And it's almost, that's why I told the story about Mandy, that you really bring the presence to something. And we're going to lean a little bit into, well, if your soul's driving you for something greater, then, and I think the reason I spoke so deeply about it is we've got to be careful about what the word greater means when it comes to service to God. Can I just leave that for a second? You guys know what I mean? We're very lost in what the word, I've got a greater purpose. Well, your greater purpose might be to bring up a little girl and to bring that little girl up to change the world one day. Being a parent might be your greatest purpose. Healing your family, but on the simplistic way of showing them how, just in your own love. So yes, yeah. So the second kind of discomfort is the one that even though we are able to bring love, presence, acceptance, we are able to fully show up in the lives that exist. If you cannot find some form of presence in what you're doing, you will not find it in a greater purpose. And where that pushes us now is, as I was saying, we don't have people that are brutally honest with us. And you see this, I mean, I'm digressing now, but you see this a lot in the modern world of, let's use like pop idols and those things. It takes literally someone that they don't know, a complete stranger, on a public platform, which I think those shows are horrible, I really do. But let's be honest, a good 50% of those people are absolutely stunned when they're told they can't sing. Now, I'm not talking about singing. We know singing as in, that's why I hate those shows. Singing is an expression, and it is exactly what it needs to be. But if someone's going to buy your actual records, that's a different conversation. You're talking about the monetarization of certain skill. And a lot of these people only find out on the day like that, well, I shouldn't be necessarily a professional singer. So let me explain to you what I mean by this brutality. And it's actually such a simple thing. There is what you want to do, and there is what you can do. It's that simple. Oh, and try and have this conversation with people searching for a purpose. They get quite angry with you. Don't limit me. Well, I'm not limiting you. It's very unlikely that you are going to be an astronaut. You're 46 years old. It's just quite logical. There is what you want to do, and there is what you can do. And you have to find some sort of an apex. You know, X and Y are meeting at a certain point where you actually have to have that practical conversation. But with that difficulty aside, let's move now more to what Spirit says about purpose. The really, really exciting thing when you have this conversation is if you are willing to consider a very interesting thing, and we're just going to, so we don't sell the doctrine here, let's just play along here. But let's assume that we're all correct, and I say all of you because I know most of you to be quite spiritual. Let's assume this fact that there's actually no fault in your life, and that every piece of adversity, disease, distress, whatever that you faced, possibly has a deeper purpose pattern to it. And if that is true, we discover something quite extraordinary that has been playing out for millennia. And what that is that if you could imagine the overturning of a mighty stone or the felling of a great oak, that in the journey of your own hero's journey, going and descending into the darkness to face this thing that is absolutely unique for you, and in the facing of that thing, you will discover some jewel that can be bought out on the other side for your community. This is the story of the hero's journey, and it's one of the deepest in every religion or every spiritual form of philosophy ever taken form. There is the hero's journey. You get called, you deny the call. Eventually the call becomes so strong that it makes you sick. Eventually you have no choice. You go into the hero's journey and you gradually descend into your initiation or your own hell. And after a long period of trying to face this darkness, you either become completely, now this is why I say we need brutality in this conversation. Many people die. Many people don't come back. Now, I'm not getting into the spiritual side of essentially what that means. Maybe you get many chances. Maybe we've tried many times. But let's be honest. I mean, we know for a fact that we don't all emerge from our hero's journey because we have mental institutions filled with people. And we know this because people die of drug overdoses every single day. I'm not saying that they're lost or anything. I don't know. But I know that for their own hero's journey, we actually have a small percentage of people that really emerge. And it has been spoken about from Rumi to the Vedic scrolls of thousands of years ago. They've been talking about a soul takes on almost the greater adventure that they can, but the bigger of the darkness that they take on, the greater the light they can anchor. But it's like playing Russian roulette in a way, because, well, you might just realize that this life you didn't quite accomplish your task. And I like this because I do know that we have a fate, and I do know that we are predestined to try and accomplish something, but we need to sober ourselves up in the realization that we don't always accomplish it, and that many fall by the side of the sword. And what this has to do something is, let's anchor this. What does this mean for you? I want you to consider that every single person in this room has a life theme that is completely unique to you, that is your Achilles heel. And whatever that Achilles heel is so overwhelming for you that it is repeated in many, many different ways. And you will know if it is your purpose pattern, because it will usually take you an entire lifetime to overturn the energetic charge of the thing that you are trying to face. So that's the first thing. To find our purpose, we need to do what's called find our shadow mission. And our shadow mission is essentially the thing that is outplaying almost what feels like beyond your will. Like, even though you're aware of it, it just keeps happening. It's the thing that you will be called to go on such a victorious, wild, incredible, independent adventure to actually heal it, is what is called your shadow mission. For some people, it is a lifetime of addiction. For some time, it is sexual abuse. For some people, it is multiple things like that. Some people, it is insecurity. Some people, it is phobias that they don't understand. And it's an extraordinary thing, because once you build your shadow mission and you are aware of what loop is repeating, your purpose, when we talk about spiritual purpose, because I hope I was powerfully clear on how purpose with presence can be found in anything, your purpose tends to lie on the victory or the overturning of that thing, which you would essentially have to do something completely, almost extraordinary to heal. And those are our deepest purposes. In practicality, that is why the greatest AA facilitators are ex-alcoholics. That is why some of the best babysitters in the world had dysfunctional parents. That is why some of the most profound psychologists in the world have psychological problems. That is, does it make sense? Just connect to that energy. It's that push and pull of the very thing that has eaten you away is the thing that you have to bring into the world. And there's an extraordinary thing in Mahayana Buddhism, right at the core of the teachings, is the saying. It does not translate perfectly, but just be with us for a second. If you cannot find it, become it. And that is how they find purpose. If you cannot find emotional safety in your life, you cannot find honesty, if you cannot find the kind of love that you really need, if you cannot, any of those things, become it. You are like the lighthouse that is searching for its own bulb. I can be practical. I'll give you an example. My talks and the work I do are mostly around fear. It is because I have been terrified my whole life. No, but it is because I have been terrified my whole life. I am leaning into my purpose pattern. I am almost going, I don't want to be afraid. I don't want to admit that I am afraid, but there must be a perfection to the fact that there is something about me that has chosen a lifetime of absolute intense themes of fear, and behind it must lie some victory. Otherwise, surely my soul is lost. And in leaning to that, I found a kind of purpose, because I want you to become aware that most people have multiple purposes. And that's a very special thing. So why I'm sharing my own story about talking about fear, I'm not necessarily completely victorious on the conversation. And one of the greatest things that we have to face when we're starting to look into our shadow mission so that we can decide what our light mission is. And that is why shadow work is becoming one of the biggest modern conversations in spirituality. It's our unconscious knowing that until we can look at the absolute darkness that has us fatalistically moving in a cycle that is almost beyond our control. Look at astrology. Astrology is the idea that there is a fate, and the fate will outplay. In other words, certain forces are outplaying, but at a certain point of enlightenment, you can begin to tread above those forces. In other words, not be ripped by this planet. And because at a certain point, you become aware of the forces that are moving within you, and you become a free-willed individual, according to deep esoteric philosophy, astrology. In ancient astrology, you did not have free will until you became fully aware of the forces that were making the same thing outplay all the time. And that's why they would use astrology. And then you would look upon those forces and you would begin to meet them fully not in trying to be happy, not in trying to avoid adversity, but in fully meeting those things, you would have the victories of free will. And this is an extraordinary conversation, because I'm almost saying to you that if you really want to find your purpose, you have to take a very deep dive into your darkness. And you have to become soberingly honest with your downfalls and with what you're repeating. Shadow work, diarizing, writing down so that you can actually see that you're often making the same mistake, no matter how many promises you make yourself. And in finding that, you begin to then write your light mission. And your light mission would be, I'll give you one of mine. It's not very long, but here's one of mine. I have experienced such desperation and such fear that I have never found anybody that could make me feel okay during those times. So I'm becoming it. I am speaking into what it is that I needed. I am becoming the thing that I wished was holding my own hand. Does it make sense? In my darkness, I am allowing my light to emerge. And this is a very important conversation, because I want to point this out to you. If it truly is your purpose, it takes a lifetime to fully turn the stone over and see what's underneath the stone. If you look at Vedic astrology, only at 61 are you supposed to be at the point where you are ready to fully understand what you're giving back. 61. Up until then, you're still transmuting, you're still working through things. And this conversation is really, really powerful, because you begin to realize that in fully owning, now we've got it the other way around. In modern metaphysical, it's not even fair to say metaphysical, in New Age spirituality, we got this idea that if you run towards the light, you understand your purpose. You cannot do that. You've got to get so down and dirty into the whole thing. But what's an extraordinary thing is there's a second thing that slows us down from fully embracing our purpose. And that thing is imposter syndrome, because we do not realize that the thing that we really, really need to be doing, we're going to feel like we're imposter. I can tell you how many times I've done a talk on fear or helped somebody face the deepest demon within themselves that I've gone home thinking, but you just fake. You can't always do that. You've lain crying or drinking yourself into a stupor. You've caused destruction beyond belief in the face of fear. Who the fuck are you to sit and talk about fear? And that is something that you can only take on for yourself. And that is what makes it such a magnificent thing, is to be willing to be on that path of exploration where you are willing to face the doubt and you're willing to realize that you will expand at each stage of this process. And if you can stay humble enough to admit that you don't have it all figured out, that you are literally going to be an inspiration to whatever it is. And guys, you don't have to expand your minds where you think. I can tell you now that one of the most purposeful things I've ever done in my life was coach a 7-year-old soccer team of girls. It was one of the most profound experiences of my life. And that's why I started this conversation the way I did. If we really are getting present with ourselves, you could literally go down to your local, we've got one right here, go down to your local sports thing and ask them if they need coaches, and you will be absolutely stunned how excited they are if you would just teach a little kids class or something. You know what I mean? So to end this conversation about, and that's what I would like to do with you guys, I would like to do your shadow mission. So that's why I want to do it one-on-one. And if we can fully own what your shadow mission is, I've been talking about mine. I'm not looking down on you. I'm talking about my fear, self-destruction. My job, I feel, is to some ways invoke courage. That in some ways has been with the 7-year-old little girl playing soccer. I like to invoke courage because I want to be the thing that I cannot find. And in that, I'm finding it. And to turn that imposter syndrome over is a lifetime of work. But the last thing that I wouldn't be being honest with you if I didn't want to put this into this beautiful conversation that we've begun. If you really do believe that there is a fabric of the universe that is interwoven within you, you begin to realize that actually the greatest purpose of all is to improve yourself as a human being. And that it does sound like a belief, but I think that there is every part of every fiber of our beings that are always reaching out for the betterment of ourselves. It is the birth of all religions. It is the birth of all sacred books. It is the birth of all compassion. All art is birthed from something within us, always reaching for something greater, for something more beautiful. And to me, I think many people reach a stage where they realize that no matter what vehicle they're using to expand into this purpose, however they are creating acts of service through medical, through spiritual, through whatever it is that they're doing in these great acts of service, one of the greatest things I feel of purpose is to make sure that when we die, that we have enriched, grown, and improved the capacity that we have for love. So that is a very big conversation that we've opened. And I'm hoping that instead of giving you an answer, that I've triggered a few things in you and that I've made you question your own motives and your own motivation. But at the same time, I'm hoping that what it leaves you is, first of all, if you are improving yourself as a human being each week, to know that you are already in a purpose pattern, but also to know that if you are amidst great adversity, even if you are quite far in age and feeling like there are things you just still can't solve, then it is just even greater the gift that you wish to bring for that very thing that you overturn. There is not a possibility to hold a greater light. This has been written by so many philosophers, without holding a greater darkness. But at the same exciting time, that means the greater the darkness that you face, the more the light that you can actually anchor, that can be present with your life and your being, and whatever the purpose pattern that you choose is.